Well, good evening. Welcome to class number 2 in our summer series on restoring the sacred in a secular age. For those that you were here last time, you will recall that in class 1, we covered what is secularism as a philosophical and cultural idea in history. And you might recall that we looked at the Enlightenment, where much of secularism originates. And we arrived at a kind of definition of secularism as the claim that you can organize society and understand the human person apart from any reference to what's transcendent, to God, or the Judeo-Christian heritage. That rather, reason alone, working with its own presuppositions, without any appeal to faith or revelation, can establish moral and basic claims that allow societies to function, in the West in particular. And we saw how, as we walk the hard ground of Enlightenment thinkers up through Marx and Nietzsche, that this project of the Enlightenment, reason working alone, has failed and in fact has led to the disintegration of society and the human person. We also said one other thing, that it's a kind of heresy regarding the doctrine of creation, namely, that God created the world and everything in it, and it was good, and that life without God isn't just, oh well, there's no God and we just have neutral secularism, but rather we have a destructive society. And so we've laid the groundwork of what secularism means and what it is in history. Tonight's class is going to be a little more concrete and a little less philosophy and a little more examples of secularism in the church today. And I picked examples that I hope you will appreciate. There could be many examples that I could have selected. And I could even had multiplied examples within these. But if you think about it, the overall theme that I perceive over the last, say, 50 years in the church is a de-emphasis of the sacred, a de-emphasis of God as other, God as spiritual, as something beyond myself, and yet I participate in God's life in an immanent way, in a very intimate way as well. And yet the transcendence of God, the holiness of God, the otherness of God has been in some ways absorbed by you and I, us. And so, as I emphasize, God as other, as not you. God may be in you, but he's not you. And so that sounds, as a general concept, interesting, but I'll walk you through examples in music, architecture, the popular teachings by some Catholic leaders on conscience, as examples of how the secular has absorbed the sacred in the church, how the otherness of God, as other, as not you, has been compromised and obscured to the detriment of the dignity of the human person. So we'll walk through examples of this. I'll close by looking at how secularism affects leaders in many different ways. And fundamentally, it affects leaders in the church by establishing false priorities for the church. And we'll talk about what that means. What does that look like? So that's what we have for this evening. So you'll see how I apply secularism as a concept in history and in philosophy and culture to the church as it's traveling now, over the last 50 years even. To get a little more of a precise handle on this, I took a quote from, I don't know if people subscribe to First Things or not, but there was something in First Things, which is a Christian periodical that comes out monthly. And there was an article here by Michael Hanby that I just wanted to quote to you from, and he's reflecting on secularism in the church, and even concludes that it is a kind of functional atheism, which we touched on in class 1. So, quote, secularism means the loss of the superiority of the immutable over the changeable. a superiority paradoxically that ensures that the mundane things of the world, for example, man and woman, are invested with inherent meaning and intelligibility as symbol and image of the immutable. In theological terms, this means the inevitable loss of the transcendent otherness and holiness of God, whose subjective correlate is the fear of the Lord. We remember that's one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And that doesn't necessarily mean terror of God, your hair standing on end. It means awe, wonder. So not we're terrorized by God, but we're in awe of God. So this loss of the transcendent is most conspicuous in the liturgy of the post-conciliar church, or at least in the manner in which it is often celebrated, with its saccharine pieties, sentimental pop music, therapeutic homilies, and drive-through communion lines. Whatever the merits of traditionalist arguments against the Novus Ordo, which is the Mass that came out of Vatican II, they are surely right in at least this much: where the majesty of God's holiness is absent from the liturgy of the church, fear of the Lord cannot long survive among the people, be they lay, be they clerical or lay. Now this is interesting. He goes a bit further. But while the restoration of the liturgy may be a necessary condition for a true sense of God, it is not a sufficient one. Treated as such, it always risks degenerating into a kind of boutique Catholicism, external to our fundamental apprehension of the world. For this spiritual deprivation has an intellectual corollary. Philosophically speaking, de-Hellenization, that's a philosophical term meaning a rejection of the classical order of being, God as transcendent. Means the eclipse of an order of being, nature and truth that transcends history, the triumph of time over eternity. This is what de-Hellenization means. This eclipse of a sense of God, of a sense of man, of a sense of being, of a sense, as he puts here, that truth is above history, unlike what Marx thought, where truth is enacted in history. It can't be abstracted away from history. And as I mentioned, the triumph of time over eternity, with the corresponding reduction of nature to meaningless matter and a reduction of truth to so many social, political, or psychological situations. He's describing our culture today, right now. Truth is what we momentarily agree on at a given point in time in history. What is good and moral is what we have consensus on at any point in time in history. Which is why the leftist, the relativist, always has a tough time, by the way, debating crimes against humanity in history. Because what standard would you appeal to outside of history to say, for example, the crimes against humanity in the Nazi era against the Jewish people, or what the Chinese did to the Japanese people, or the Turks to the Armenians at the beginning of the 20th century? What standard would you appeal to critique those acts, lawful acts of the state, let's say, as wrong or crimes against humanity? What would be the basis? There would be no basis. That's the point. And that's the point Michael Hanby is making. Is there not a truth that does transcend history? Of course there is. As Catholics, we believe this as such, as do all Christians and Jews and Muslims. Monotheistic faiths believe this. So, he then concludes this portion that I quoted with the functional atheism in the church today. Experience shows that pious belief in a truncated God and moralism in both the left and right-wing variations can live quite comfortably in the shadow of the eclipse of God. Truncated God. God who, as we said in class 1, never makes real contact with us. The point, rather, is that God's being and the meaning of our creaturehood inform neither their basic conception of the world nor the fundamental mode and pattern of their thinking. God only enters into their thoughts secondarily, in a reduced, superficial, extrinsic, and cynical cases, instrumental way, as an addendum to empiricists, historicists, and technical ways of thinking that are functionally atheistic. Now, Father, present company excluded, how many of us have heard homilies where the gospel message is tangential and it pricks the conscience of the priest to talk about something you could hear at the Elks Club about you should make sure you sweep the sidewalk in front of your home, and general housekeeping for working with others and be kind to others and be kind to pets. Nothing distinctively Christian about it. Nothing distinctively earth-shaking about it. The gospel is merely a reminder of what naturally we should be thinking about. Nothing about what the offer is from Jesus Christ to save us from ourselves, because we're already pretty good. Do we really need saving? Or just affirmation about what we want to do anyway? So this is the functional atheism conceptually that is permeating many centers of the church today and leadership. And you can see why I'm starting here rather than just starting with the abuse crisis, which, is, I said in class 1, is merely a symptom of this, what I claim, functional atheism that's in the church today. Okay, so let's go to examples. So everyone remembers this song, "I will not inflict my singing on you. Do not worry, but gather us in," and so on. I bolded, and this, when I was in the seminary in the 80s, this was sung daily, and when it was sung before lunch, I often didn't go to lunch. But I'm just kidding. I enjoyed the cafeteria at the seminary. But what's the emphasis? And I bolded, if you read, and do people know this song? Have you heard this song? Yeah, okay. And we sung it with glee and kind of felt good about it in some diluted way. But see in this space our fears and our dreamings. We shall rise at the sound of our name. We have been sung throughout all of history, and so on. Not in the dark of buildings confining, not in some heaven light years away. You see what's going on? Who's being celebrated here? Me, myself, and I, right? Now there are tinges of a God in here, interlaced in some way, but and we have some kind of interesting Eucharistic references in that section over on the top right. So it's never overt, this secularism I'm talking about in the church. It's always kind of an atmosphere. It's a hue. It's a kind of turning up the treble on the stereo. And what's being celebrated here is the community without any particular significance. This could be sung by a lot of different groups, actually, who have nothing to do with Christianity. Isn't it an odd thing? This was probably one of the most popular hymns in the 80s and 90s, and you still hear it today. Now, if you hear it in Mass, if someone selects it, be reasonable. But what I'm pointing out is how subtle it is also. We kind of want to celebrate ourselves. After all, didn't Vatican II say the church is the people of God? We'll cover that in class 3 next week on what that term actually means. Okay, but you'll see the contrast in other hymns from the past. And there are current hymns written in this vein, in this style. What's being celebrated here? The emphasis I put on God's glory, what He has done for us, and our response to that. So now thank we all our God. We're very familiar with those lyrics. Even in the title, now thank we all our God. Where's the title of the other one? Gather us in, us. So this is vertical. The other one was horizontal. Or Tantum Ergo. We have the Feast of Corpus Christi coming up, the body and blood of Jesus. The beautiful hymn and lyrics of Thomas Aquinas. Reflecting on the Eucharist, that's what he's referring to in the first 2 stanzas. We pray this at benedictions. And then it ends with a Trinitarian praise. You see how the emphasis is on God and the sanctity that comes from worshiping and adoring God. Whoops. Architecture. This is probably even more obvious to us who were sentient in the 70s and 80s and beyond. This continued into the 90s and even now with new churches being built. But this is the famous chapel at Josephinum in Worthington, Ohio. And on the left panel, as it indicates in black and white, unfortunately, you see this beautiful church chapel and sanctuary area, and your eyes naturally go to the center and up. And of course, with the renewed understanding of the liturgy that actually had no basis in Vatican II, sometime in the 1980s, they painted over that back section. Same church, my friends. So 1930s, 1980s. Because we can't have all this imagery distracting us from what? See the chairs in the sanctuary? Now, if you need the room, you need the room. I have nothing against this per se, but look what we went from. A sense of the holy and the transcendent. You thought this was a different church. It's the same church. How do you pray in this space? How would it compare to your here? It feels different, doesn't it? But we have a happy restoration that occurred. This is the same church. And this occurred a few years ago, and they restored as best they could the basic. If you see these images here, there are some differences. They just couldn't restore it completely, but they captured the same aesthetic. And your eyes go to the tabernacle, the cross, and up. You see the difference architecturally between a secular space and a sacred space. And the chairs are out of the sanctuary. Now let me take us closer to home. 1984, Church of St. Mary. Now this is taken from the choir loft. And this was, as you can see, a wedding. And yours truly is right there. A full head of hair. And so you see how your eye goes right up to the tabernacle and the cross, the crucifix. And then the side altars beautifully embellish, enhance. You have Mary, and you have the Holy Family. As an altar boy, we used to have to walk around this way and then back. There were no doors there. This is the 80s, so you see banners were in vogue then, hanging things from the rafters, kind of like sports pennants was popular back then. We don't have the banners anymore. What do we have? Where does your eye go? Your eye kind of goes here, and then you kind of get lost. What's being celebrated or emphasized in this architectural approach? You see what I'm getting at? The people, the gathered people. How does it feel to pray in that space? Where's your God point? Where's the tabernacle? Oh, here it is. You see, now this is not taken from the choir loft. So admittedly, it's two different perspectives. But you see how you can't settle on anything. We've got Mary's statue here. We've got a nice, beautiful painting of Mary here. It looks a bit like a scratch and dent sale at Marshall Fields. Now, the good news is I'm not criticizing any leaders today because this happened, I want to say, 20 years ago. But you see what was the mood, the secular mood of, well, we should celebrate the gathered people. Now, there's nothing wrong with celebrating the community, but if it's untethered from what is sacred, what is holy, we're muddled, we're lost. And I would argue The reason why there's more talking in church before Mass starts is precisely this architecture. Would you talk as much here before Mass? Would you talk as much before Mass here? How was your weekend? You wouldn't, would you? You see how lyrics, architecture, how we pray, whether we pray, who we pray to, God or our big toe, matters. Matters quite a bit. And it didn't just stay in the liturgy. Comments or questions so far? Well, I always look at the cornerstone of churches. When were they built? And without fail, you can almost see when the change hit based upon when the cornerstone was built. If you look at St. Patrick's, Westlake Forest, you have the old church, which is smaller, but has this traditional vector up. And then you have the O'Gara Center, which when you walk in, you're kind of in the round. You've got nothing behind the altar, but you've got the sides and then kind of the chute. So that's okay, but it's very sparse in there. If you've been in St. Patrick's in the O'Gara Center complex, it's very minimalistic, which was also a theme, not necessarily secular. This will take us into deeper water of liturgical styles. Some styles are minimalistic. The robes that the priest wears are very simple, and there's a place for that. That wasn't the agenda, though, was it, when we whitewash churches that are already existing? Or this effect. This is a style that I'm arguing is not suitable ultimately to reverencing the sacred. And we are body, soul. We need images to reflect on God and God's plan for us in our life, just as you have family photos of loved ones, current and past, to remind you of your family. It's the most natural thing in the world to have statues, to have holy cards, to have holy sacred windows, stained glass windows, altars that point us to what is transcendent. It's the most natural thing in the world to have images like that. And what's odd is throughout history, the church goes through spasms. It's called iconoclasm, of smashing altars, smashing statues. This was done all throughout the church's history. It's this kind of odd cyclical revulsion of material being pointing to the transcendent. It's an odd phenomenon that the human spirit falls into. We fell into it. I think we're coming out of it, frankly, because you see the renovations are actually improvements more. But this secularism is still with us. Good. Let's move to another area, a bit more theological, but also very common in our experience, namely conscience, our conscience. And there's a quotation from an author, David Bentley Hart. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's actually a Greek Orthodox theologian who writes extensively on atheism, its effects in society, and it's someone I enjoy reading because he's got a wonderful wit. And let me read this passage to you as a way of setting up the discussion on conscience and the self. Because we recall from class 1, part of secularism is the exaltation of the self in isolation from God. Quote, "Modernity's highest idea, its special understanding of personal autonomy, requires us to place our trust in an original absence underlying all of reality, a fertile void in which all things are possible, from which arises no impediment to our wills, and before which we may consequently choose to make of ourselves what we choose. We trust that there is no substantial criterion by which to judge our choices that stands higher than the unquestioned good of free choice itself, and that therefore all judgment, divine no less than human, is in some sense an infringement upon our freedom. This is our primal ideology. In the most unadorned terms possible, the ethos of modernity is, to be perfectly precise, nihilism, There's that word again. We talked about nihilism last class, namely the denial of any objective standpoint, the denial of all values and truth claims that are trans-historical, that Friedrich Nietzsche elaborated on, and that rather we're left with the self and the furnace of the self to make something of itself in isolation. This is what he meant by we place our trust in an original absence. Nihilism is this original negation of all truth claims. Something from nothing. You might recall me talking about this in past years, is the essence of Gnosticism, and in this case, secularism. Darwinism. You can get order from disorder. Stephen Hawking. You can get multiverses from nothing. Nihilism. You can get liberation of the human person from an original disorder. An original nothing. A pregnant nothing. Why? Because it relieves me of any limits to my freedom. This is the essence of magic. And oddly enough, as Catholics, we are one of the remaining sole defenders of human reason in its fullness, of what is rational. You can't get something from nothing. You get something from something. I know this sounds obvious, but look at the major claims of Darwin. You get order from chaotic disorder. Marx, you get the proletariat and freedom from alienation from conflicts and negations. What's the third mystery religion of our time? Freudianism, not so popular anymore because we use medicines more, we prescribe more than do therapies, but the unconscious. Nothing is the true reality of the self. You see how mystery religions all throughout time and space have always worked? Magic, something from nothing. Classical metaphysics is no. You get something from something. Let's talk about what that something is. All the natural sciences proceed this way until they impinge on metaphysics, and then they look silly because they have to rely on getting something from nothing. So nihilism is our cultural mantra now, whether we like it or not. And it has infected the church. Let's look at it. We will talk more about human sexuality in class 4, but conscience is probably most in the news in the areas of sexual matters or bioethics, human cloning, stem cell research, and so forth. And in who gets to receive communion, who doesn't, what are acceptable sexual practices, what are not, what are appropriate marriages, what are not, and so forth. So these presentations on the left panel, I called my notes from past articles about bishops throughout time over the last 40, 50. These are quotes I've modified from bishops. So it's not from your local crank. It's bishops in the church throughout the 60s after Humani Vitae came out in 1968, commenting and issuing documents and statements in newspaper articles. So we do a left-right panel here. So conscience is our supreme guide and must always be followed. To violate one's conscience is wrong. Self-worship first, then we find our God through that lens. We even have that expression still in our culture. Do what your God tells you to do. My God says this, your God says that. You see how that language has already given away the game? We modify God with our, your. There's no God, there is my appropriation of God. You might say, well, is there any other kind? So let's talk about that. Now, this is true to some extent as far as it goes, which is why these things are so subtle. Just as at St. Mary's Church as it exists now. Yeah, there's a tabernacle there. There's the cross, the crucifix centrally hung. It's not overtly secular. There are elements of spirituality there, certainly. So too, this teaching, conscience is our supreme guide, subjectively speaking. And Aquinas did say, you ought to follow your conscience, regardless. He did say that. So, this truth, it's like a half brick that you can throw them twice as far as a full brick. And that's why they were so popular, because it gave running room for people to abandon church teaching, if their conscience prompted them to do that. And that's where the discussion stopped, typically. But if you read the right panel, yes, conscience is our supreme guide. And it ought to be followed. Why? Because it is tethered, as I put it, to the truth, capital T, in a mysterious way. As I mentioned, it's a dramatic association with God and the truth. Conscience has this affinity for the truth, capital T, even though it is my conscience. And it's described in many ways as the garden of the soul, where God meets us. All true. But conscience, without talking about that tethering, that alignment to the truth, would just be mere instinct. Why would it have dignity? Why would we follow it other than by instinct or preference, or it gets what I want? You see how conscience would have no dignity if it wasn't already in some mysterious way linked to God and the truth. That's why we follow it. That's why it has dignity. The sweet summons of conscience isn't this my sweetness, it's God's sweetness. You should do this, avoid that. That is this beautiful association, this dialogue in the garden of our soul with God. Very popular, I can tell you, in RCIA classes over the years, and again in articles. The teaching of the church is one of many voices to consult. You should consult neighbors, friends, trusted family members perhaps. And of course, all of that is true. But then the conversation ended. Because the self, in isolation from God and the church he instituted, we mumbled that later, and we were kind of embarrassed by it. So, the dignity of conscience, as I mentioned, and I emphasize it because few people talk about it this way, has duties, obligations to the truth. And as we know, and we will cover in next class about the church as a kind of sacrament, which is how Vatican II described it, has a presumption of truth when it teaches something on a point of faith and morals. I should have included morals in the slide. But when the church teaches authoritatively on a point of faith and morals, to be held definitively and universally by the whole church, that is without error. It's dogmatic or doctrinal and commands our assent. And the presumption is with the church in that teaching. It's not just equal to your neighbor down the street or a family member who you are very close to. So the church is not just one voice among many, nor is it simply a man-made institution, by the way. But it is infused by the promise of Christ and his guarantee of the Holy Spirit to walk with it and to protect it from error in its official acts of teaching. At root, the secularism and its enveloping of conscience, it views freedom as a physical power, not a moral power. Meaning, I am most free when I have the most number of options to pick from. Freedom is not a freedom for, it's a freedom from. We're ships without a port. We're music without a score. We're means, we're not ends. And so freedom from is the essence of freedom. That is a nihilistic, godless understanding of freedom. In a Catholic understanding, freedom is a spiritual power to choose the good. And I'm not free, in fact, if I don't choose the good. That sounds confining all of a sudden, doesn't it? Are you free to draw a triangle? You're only free to draw a triangle on condition you give it 3 sides. If in a stroke of broad-mindedness you said, no, I'm not going to have my freedom limited. I'm going to draw it with 32 sides. You're not free to draw a triangle. If you said, I want to learn a new language. I'm traveling to Italy. I want to speak Italian. Are you free to speak Italian? No, you have to subject yourselves to laws of grammar, vocabulary, verb tenses, to be understood. You are free in the truth, only. You free to drive your car? Do anything you want with it? Put orange juice in the gas tank? Suppose you said, I'm not going to let the owner's manual tell me what I put in the tank. I'm not going to have some outside transcendent being who designed me telling me how to run the vehicle. I'm going to put orange juice in that tank. You're not free to drive a car, are you? You see how subtle the nihilism and secularism of our time have made us think that freedom is about options. In the moral area, it's about options. That's not the Catholic understanding of freedom. We are free in the truth. Only. Everything else is license. Okay. And in fact, Paul calls it the slavery of sin. Slavery. And then common in the press today, I can continue in a lifestyle of objective sin without ongoing spiritual and theological scrutiny. Once I make a sincere decision of conscience, I'm hermetically sealed for all time in my life. I never need to revisit any decision I've made in my past. And yet we now know, as we march through this, that I am obligated to inform my conscience continually, to find out. Friends and neighbors, certainly. And most importantly, the teaching of the Catholic Church in the areas of faith and in particular morals. There's something subtle here that I want to point out that even well-intentioned Orthodox people fall into, and it's this distinction between immorality and sin. So, classic Baltimore Catechism, Catechism of the Church, I cannot sin gravely by mistake, by accident. Remember the conditions for a mortal sin? I have to know it's grave matter. It needs and violates the will of God. It should be grave, and I choose it with sufficient freedom. Sufficient knowledge, sufficient freedom, and it's grave. If I'm lacking in those, it might be wrong what I'm doing, but it's not gravely sinful. These are the classic distinctions in moral theology, the difference between immorality and sin. You recall this? Okay. This is presented by popular misguided folks as that's the end of the discussion as it relates to the moral life and the spiritual life, as if having limited or no culpability means my habits, my dispositions, my obsessions, my addictions don't matter. In other words, grace doesn't touch nature. Grace doesn't renew nature. I can continue on in a sinful lifestyle if I'm sincere, and it has no implications for my moral life, for my nature. You see how that takes us back to this weird dualism between grace and nature. Now, I'm not saying that if you commit an immoral action, that even though it's not gravely sinful, it really is gravely sinful. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is if something's not gravely sinful, doesn't mean the bad actions you are doing and you continue to do, let's say abuse drugs, don't have an effect on you. It would be ridiculous to say, well, you're not sinning, but if you continue to take the heroin, because you're not sinning, it has no effect on your nature. That's ridiculous. Of course it does. And people who are in sinful lifestyles, who don't recognize it as such, they're still accumulating habits, dispositions, depravities that can lead them to spiritual ruin. That's the point here. And to pretend as if nature and what's immoral has no bearing on future dispositions for choosing correctly is another sign of the times of the creeping secularism in our church. Because often this further distinction is not made. Because as I mentioned here, morality is not about breaking a law, primarily. It's about disfiguring ourselves. It's about violating virtues, which promote human, sometimes called flourishing, making ourselves into a disciple of Jesus, developing the spiritual life. If morality was about breaking a law the way we might break a speed limit law, why do you feel a twinge of conscience when you do break a moral law and you don't when you drove 60 miles an hour on a 55? You see the difference? If morality is primarily about law in the sense of compliance, the way you might comply to a tax code, that's not what morality is. Now, morality feels like a law that we're under, and it is expressed in law, just as a medical book expresses laws of physiology that are true. Don't mistake the piece of paper that the law is written on with the life that biology describes. So too, moral theology describes what the human person runs on, virtues. And for the sake of convenience, we codify that into moral laws, the natural law, the eternal law, which the natural law participates in. If we merely reduce our behavior to, am I following the law, we are missing what the moral life, the spiritual life is about, which is turning ourselves into something godlike, not compliance, which, as we've seen over the last 50 years, doesn't motivate a lot of people over time. Now, the last point I make here, the Ten Commandments, I'm not advocating for their overthrow. Of course not. They are codifications of the moral law, which are highly instructive for teaching children, adults. But if you are constantly consulting the Ten Commandments the way you might consult a map if you're driving, it's not quite rooted in you yet. You see what I'm getting at? So law exists as a codification of the moral and spiritual life. And just because that's useful for teaching doesn't mean that should be our mentality about why we follow it. We follow it, we are moral, we are spiritual because we want to be like God. We want the virtues of God. We want the discipleship of Jesus. Okay. So you see how today in our culture, conscience is presented on the left panels. Me, myself, and I am Joe, the boss of my body and the arbiter of all things, and it begins and ends with me. That is a very crude and distorted view of what the Catholic Church actually says about conscience. Namely, It is tethered already, always already, to the truth, capital T. That's why it has dignity. And if we turn the page, we see the beautiful quotation from John Paul II's encyclical Veritas Splendor, where after a long discussion on conscience, he ends this way: keeping the balance, which I've been talking about. Although each individual has a right to be respected in his own journey in search of the truth, there exists a prior moral obligation, and a grave one at that, to seek the truth and to adhere to it once it is known. As Cardinal John Henry Newman, that outstanding defender of the rights of conscience, forcefully put it, conscience has rights because it has duties. Otherwise, it's just animal instinct. Let's pivot now to the last topic, which is how has secularism infected church leadership? I mentioned two things here about leadership. There are many things that could be said about leadership, whether it's in a business organization, a non-for-profit, various organizations, and the church is an organization. Let's not kid ourselves. It's a global organization with structures. And I feel that these two apply really to any organization. There are more that could be said, but we'll stay with these two. Setting the right priorities that are easily understood and motivating. And I would add, for the time that you are in, whether it's a business or the church, setting the right priorities for the people, the organization, is critical. Because priorities are about investment of time, energy, resources, and it will drive outcomes. It will drive, quote unquote, the marching orders. So it's critical. And running both organizations in business where I've been responsible for, say, 4,000 people in six countries, to the startup companies I've had where it's a group of 10 folks in an office, the same is true. You must set the proper priorities for the organization, and you must be fanatical about putting a headlock on them and communicating them consistently and clearly. And in a, why are they the priorities? We could talk about metrics and other things that measure that. That's more of a business thing. We'll stay away from that. The second one, people are policy. The people you hire and promote, in the case of the church, bishops and cardinals, are loud and clear calls about what you value and what your priorities are. I've always found great leaders pick great people. Sometimes they pick mediocrities, but great leaders pick great people. Mediocre leaders generally pick mediocrities in business. Perhaps it's true in the church. So there's a school of thought that says the way you get a line on a pope of what are his priorities, read his first encyclical. It's an interesting school of thought. So the first encyclical of John Paul II, could have gone back many, but we'll stick with contemporaries that we know about. John Paul II's first encyclical, Redemptor Homines, the Redeemer of Man, 1979. Let's just read a few passages from it. The Redeemer of man, Jesus Christ, is the center of the universe and of history. To him go my thoughts and my heart in this solemn moment of the world that the church and the whole family of present-day humanity are now living. What an interesting start. Then later, to this question, dear brothers, regarding the mystery of Christ, a fundamental and essential response must be given. Our response must be, our spirit is set in one direction. The only direction for our intellect, will, and heart is towards Christ our Redeemer, towards Christ, the Redeemer of man. We wish to look towards him because there is salvation in no one but him, the Son of God, repeating what Peter said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. What a beautiful start to the encyclical. No mention of law, by the way, rather to a person, Jesus Christ. We want to be like him. We want to be with him, a person. A person always precedes morality and the spiritual life. Let's turn the page and look at Pope Benedict. I should say, before we go to Pope Benedict, that encyclical for John Paul II launched his project of his papacy, which was this Christian humanism, that Jesus Christ is the answer to every human question of the person of society. And he never left that message. Everything he did after that is an elaboration of this fundamental truth that Christ, in his death and resurrection, is the person that answers every human question and is the highest human possibility. He never left that. Pope Benedict XVI, God is love. And this unfolded as part of Pope Benedict starting with the first of three theological virtues. Love, then he moved to faith, or faith was third, and then he went to hope. He elaborated the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. He also wrote several books on the life of Jesus of Nazareth, if you remember, a reflection on Jesus. And his project was to combat the relativism that permeated the West, the secularism of the West. So let's read how he starts. God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. These words from the first letter of John express with remarkable clarity the heart of the Christian faith. The Christian image of God and the resulting image of mankind and its destiny. In the same verse, St. John also offers a kind of summary of the Christian life. We have come to know and to believe in the love God has for us. We have come to believe in God's love. In these words, the Christian can express the fundamental decision of his life. No mention of law. Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. And he proceeds to elaborate what he means by God is love and what is human love. We will touch on this in Class 4 when we talk about human sexuality and love. So Pope Francis, as we know, as the story unfolds, Pope Benedict resigns, and in 2013, March, Pope Francis is elected by the cardinal electors. So it's 2013. What were the pressing priorities of the time? Was it the ongoing relativism and atheism of the West? Was it the militant Islamic expansions in the Middle East and the destruction of churches? Maybe it was on the missions and the outreach to Asia. Maybe it was ecumenical as a priority. If we can consolidate Christianity, maybe the Christian witness to the world can be stronger. So let's look and see what the priorities are. Laudato Si. I star that because it's not the first encyclical published under Pope Francis. He finished off Pope Benedict's encyclical that was ready for publication. But this is Pope Francis's maiden encyclical, his first one that he authored. So let's read what he thought the priorities were. Quote, Laudato Si, mi Signor, praise be to you, my Lord. In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. I thought I was reading the tourist guide to the Davos annual meeting. And it goes on, and it elaborates all the scourges of industry against the environment, and on and on. This is what decline looks like. And I say that cautiously, but not being under the rule of a bishop, and with no fear of being assigned to that beautiful parish in Antarctica. I can hazard this opinion. What's interesting is, unlike a business which can self-correct either through the stock market or a board and remove a CEO, I'm not advocating this, of course, in the church, but there is a feedback mechanism. If you're selling garbage product, no one's going to buy it. You got to change. And if a CEO publishes our mission statement, and I'm the president of Microsoft, and our mission statement is to promote the use of calculators and handheld. You can see how that's a problem for Excel and the products that you sell. So you could pick a head of a CEO of a food manufacturer who says, you know, obesity is a big problem, and so, I mean, just pick your analogies. They just kind of flit into my mind. I mean, if you were an automobile manufacturer and said, I'm the new CEO, and we need to promote the use of bicycles. So you see how priorities matter in an organization. And I have to tell you, frankly, this was disappointing when this came out in 2015. So let's look at the facts and see if maybe the Pope is right. So in your slides, it's maybe black and white, and I provide the website for all of this data. So this data does not come from me, but it often comes from the World Bank or the UN or private researchers looking at this data. But this is just a slide, and I'll go through them quickly, on life expectancy since 1770. So, and then this is, you see how abruptly as the Industrial Revolution takes hold and quality of life improves, like clean water, sewage, outdoor plumbing, electricity, medicines, better food, transportation, refrigeration, life expectancy goes up. If we continue, this is an incredible slide. Poverty. If extreme poverty is living on less than $1.90 a day. You see how this has dramatically come down, and I'll have more to say about this later, as time has gone on. Extremely. So less than 10% of people today are living in extreme poverty versus over 80% 200 years ago. Number of people with and without electricity. So the top half is people with access. The bottom gray is people without access to electricity. From 1990 to 2016. A steady, tough increase. It'd be interesting to see what it was right after Thomas Edison. I didn't say 1770. I knew someone would say, the light bulb wasn't invented. All right. Number of under 5 deaths by region. You can see that Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, still is the largest slice, whereas South Asia and East Asia comparable to Africa have come down. And this is part of the economic miracle that has occurred in China and India over the last 30 years. And you can see in the West, we've solved a lot of that long ago. Now I pivot to, and this is satellite data from a group affiliated with NASA. So I'm not making this data up to prove my point. I'm simply taking data from government bodies. And satellites went up into orbit in 1979. So what this is measuring is taking land-ocean averages, the 1950 to 1980 mean, and comparing temperature variations to that average, 1950 to 1980, until 1979 when the satellite data starts. And then this line is comparing satellite measurements of the warmth of the troposphere, which goes up 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles. Its variation to that mean. You follow me? So satellite data, not subject to the variations from land thermometers, which we'll talk about if we need to. Like, did they build a mall across the street from the thermometer? Would that affect the temperature of that thermometer? What if they painted the building next to it black? Would that affect it? So what if they put it on the roof? Did Uncle Elmo measure the thermometer reading at the same time every day for 30 years? Maybe he had a dental appointment? Could that have happened? So you see how land-based measurements over 100 years, how rigorous is that? So you see the fluctuations. If you just looked at land-ocean temperatures, however they were collected, and proxies that are used, like ice cores and so on, the increase is 0.7% Celsius. If you look at the satellite data, the increase after 1979 to that mean, the average between 1950 and 1980, increased by 0.4%. And interestingly, in the last 2 years, there's been a come down to the mean. Now, I have the IPCC report. I couldn't project it. But if you look at the 2014 AR5 report, which is the authoritative report, the next one comes out in 2022, it will show the same pattern of comparing global land-ocean temperatures. Did you know that the vast amount of the increase in the 20th century occurred between 1900 and 1950? And that after 1950, we got warmer, but the rate of increase was less. And yet, on another slide, and you can Google this report and look at it, and look in the executive summary for policymakers, you'll see the rise in CO2 after 1950 is tremendous. And the globe does get warmer. But the rate of increase is less than from 1900 to 1950. So I'm not taking a position. I'm just telling you what the data says. So I won't read all this to you, but we hear about the horrific effects of nuclear winter. No, I mean acid rain. No, I'm sorry. I mean global warming. Oh, I'm sorry. I got it wrong again. I mean climate change. Right. I have to stay current. I'm dated. But basically what Bjorn Lomborg, who is an environmentalist and actually believes that CO2 emissions have caused the rise of global temperatures and is the primary cause, according to his thinking, still will talk about this climate alarmism. We have more tornadoes and hurricanes in the U.S., don't we? And the data says, no, we don't. There's more droughts because of climate change, isn't there? No, there isn't. What about the sea ice in the Arctic? We see the satellite, and it's true. Sea ice has reduced in the Arctic. And the models also show it should be reducing in the Antarctic, but it's not. In fact, it's increasing, according to the study. And you can see satellite photos of the Antarctic sea ice. In certain areas, it's larger. So I'm just talking about data. I'm not forming any conclusions. Here's just another anecdote, not in your handout, that I came across a few days ago. Glacier National Park in Montana. I am available for you to take me there. It is a beautiful park. Here's the sign that's been up for years, and you might have trouble reading it, I apologize. But it's the Welcome to Glacier National Park signage you all see when you go to parks. Goodbye to the glaciers is the headline. You know, you troop up to a certain point, you get to the little rest station, and you see this sign. And it says, the glaciers are now rapidly shrinking due to human-caused climate change. They got the lingo. Computer models indicate the glaciers will be all gone by the year 2020. This was taken on 2017 June. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Someone tapped them on the shoulder and said, it's 2020's next year. So reality is not behaving, because in parts of the park the glaciers are larger. So the signage has changed. When they will completely disappear, however, depends on how and when we act. So they remove they'll be all gone by 2020. We could talk about polar bears, the fact that that was also just a hoax, but we don't have time. All righty, so let's just do a global assessment and see if we're talking about the right priorities. Life expectancy in 1900 was 40. 1990 was 65. 2016, 72.5. Child literacy and child labor all have moved in the right direction. Economics. In 1990, 37.5% of the world population was living in extreme poverty, $1.90 a day or less. Less than 10% now. 1.25 billion people lifted out of poverty in 28 years. That's an economic miracle, unprecedented in human history. Nowhere in that encyclical is there a recognition of the incredible prosperity, improvement of quality of life across the globe due to market capitalism. Nowhere. You won't find it. You might find a passing reference. All you see is this gloom and doom narrative, which has an origin, and if we had time we could talk about it, in the Green Movement of Germany, and prior to that in other movements in Germany. And nowhere is there a recognition of these advances. But let's continue. And this is driven, of course, by China, India, and other places. The earth is warming. Why? The data shows that. The question is causality. What's primary? Is it burning fossil fuels? And you will hear the rejoinder, 97% of scientists believe that burning fossil fuels causes global warming. And you'll hear that bandied about all the time. We've all heard that, right? Suppose I said to you, 97% of physicians believe there are side effects from vaccinations. You see what's going on? Autism. Is it caused by vaccinations? Well, 97% of physicians say there are side effects to having your child vaccinated. You see, there's no calibration of causality. What is the contribution of burning fossil fuels to global warming? What is the contribution of vaccinations to autism in children? And of course, physicians will tell you there is no direct causality from vaccinations to autism. Why isn't there the same kind of circumspection about causality of CO2? Could it be that it promotes a certain globalist agenda in a way that sunspots do not? Or solar flares? Or the Earth's wobble, and the Earth does wobble on its axis? What's that impact on an environment? What's the hottest thing in our solar system have to do with our environment as primary? Okay, so given that, just interesting little notes from the data. Indoor air pollution caused 8% of all deaths in 1990. 4.7. You might say indoor air pollution. What's that? Poor people in India, China, other places like that, burn dung and wood to keep warm. You know that more people die from indoor air pollution in India than outdoor pollution? And then just a note on open defecation. This was more tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. Has been reduced to 15% of the world's population from 30%, and I mentioned perhaps San Francisco has not been counted. So I think we're over 30 again. So. Or the latest meeting of the state of Illinois. No. So, but I don't want you to conclude too much. I don't want you to run ahead of me in terms of what I'm concluding. CO2 plays a role in the warming of the planet. The question is, what is its magnitude? And are we open to having that conversation? Apparently not. So, to be clear, in my view, the first encyclical of Pope Francis is a muddle. But having muddled priorities doesn't make you a heretic, as some have said, or that you have bad intentions, or that you don't do well on other subjects. And the Pope has done quite well on other subjects. If you read his Wednesday audiences, there's wonderful reflections on marriage. Even the apostolic letter on the joy of loving, the first several chapters is a wonderful defense of traditional heterosexual marriage and humanae vitae. Pope Francis goes at length, at least 6 times in that apostolic letter, talking about how destructive the use of artificial contraception in heterosexual marriage, how destructive that is. We would all be very proud of what he says there. His spiritual reflections on the devil in his Wednesday audiences are very inspiring. Maybe not to the Davos crowd. They'd be like the Greeks at Athens when Paul says, let me tell you about Jesus who was crucified and rose. And at Davos they'd say, it's cocktail hour on this whole devil stuff. So the devil is in your carbon emissions. So, okay. So, and then most recently, in the last month, the Vatican, the Congregation for Education, published a statement on the problem of gender theory and its promotion in schools. So this is an excellent statement from the Vatican on gender theory, how gender can be decoupled from biology, which is of course ridiculous. So what does it mean then? It simply means the Pope misses a leadership opportunity in his first encyclical to call out the priorities of his papacy. That's what it means. And it can misguide us to some extent, but he does quite well on other subjects. And I have to say, popes can't resist. They all do it in terms of maybe their little pet hobbies or causes. They all do it. And here's one that you might not have had top of mind, but I remembered this. So I went back and read Mater et Magistra, Mother and Teacher, John the 23rd's encyclical on the Church. And in there, he spends 3 or 4 paragraphs talking about agriculture and farm policy in Europe and the need for price controls for those farmers. Which is, of course, if a high school economics textbook will explain to you the effect of price controls, whether it be on wages or commodities. If you force down, I won't go into it, but price controls simply create a tax on either consumers who purchase those goods. So a price control says you may not purchase this below a price floor, or in other cases, the price may not rise above a price ceiling. In either case, you distort the market and you get either an oversupply of goods that no one wants, in the case of agriculture. If the government guarantees that your bushel of corn will be priced at $35 a bushel and no lower, even though its actual value in the marketplace is $25 a bushel, what happens? Two things happen. You get big inventories of bushels of corn, or whatever the commodity is, that no one buys. And you get a black market of corn that's sold for $25 a bushel. So you promote vice. You promote a counter market. And the same is true in the reverse. If you force producers to sell at a low price, what do? What do rent controls do to landlords? Given that New York City just passed more rent control, what happens? As a landlord, are you going to invest in that property? You're going to maybe just keep the lights on. If there's an elevator, maybe you'll fix it. In other words, the social policies of this country for the last 40, 50 years in the poorest neighborhoods. Rent controls do nothing but destroy the asset, the resource that is under the constraint of the price control. So, but Pope John the 23rd thought that was a great idea. So you see that it's not just our current time. Popes can never resist dabbling in areas that they know little or nothing about. So, we're going to pivot in the next three classes to what I feel the priorities are, to make the sacred present in a secular age. And we're going to talk about the church next week as this transcendental and material reality, which is a good definition of a sacrament. And the church is a kind of sacrament. Human sexuality is covenantal, and I'll talk more about what that means, because human sexuality is sacramental. And then the last class wraps up the summer. This is also about the spiritual life. Making the sacred present doesn't mean we're a curator of some museum where we simply honor the Mona Lisa on a wall. It's about an actual walk with God, with the God revealed in Jesus Christ and who sent his Spirit to be among us. So all of this has to be wrapped in our spiritual walk with God. So the last three classes I will flip the script and we'll stop talking about doom and gloom and muddled priorities and misstatements and talk about the sacred in a secular age, how we make it present. So it's close to 8:30. Are there any questions? We'll take a few questions. So the question is, where is Pope Francis coming from? And it's hard to get into motivation speculation, but there's a couple things one could say. One, he is from Latin America, so all of the capitalism he experienced was crony capitalism, government-favored capitalism of the 5 people that run Argentina. So that's point one. His experience of capitalism has always been of the corrupt variety. Number 2, there is in this encyclical that we quoted from, there is a kind of anti-technology bias, anti-industry bias of let's hearken back to a Luddite, more farm-like age where we weren't slaves of technology. Now there's an aspect in which that's true. We have become enslaved by our technology. But when you, after 70 pages of that, you're saying, can we have some balance, please? Can we at least acknowledge the gains of market capitalism as humanizing, as life-giving, if nothing else, that world poverty as a result of market capitalism has been dramatically reduced? So he's coming from a frame of crony capitalism, a kind of anti-industrial bias. And I think that who you surround yourself with also matters. And anecdotally, I know some of the folks he has surrounded himself by are to the left of him even. Other question. So the question is, why isn't there more dialogue in our public square on the environmental issues, on what are the primary causes, secondary causes of global warming? Because we can acknowledge that the planet is getting warmer. The question is why and how. And I think part of the reason why there isn't the healthy dialogue on this question and other questions is what's the research grant profile look like if I said, there's evidence that actually solar flares and solar fluctuations are highly correlated with ice ages or the lack of ice ages. And people have not only begun, they've been looking at this for centuries. Or what are the correlations between the Earth, which doesn't rotate perfectly consistently year in, year out, on our global temperatures? What are the research grants for that? So part of this is money. And the other thing I would say is there is a prior commitment to globalization. Whatever assigns more power to central state authority is good. There is a movement to centralize decision-making, which has been ongoing, up and down, left and right in history. In the U.S., we have resisted this more or less throughout our history. We're coming at critical moments now in our history. If you look at our debt, the federal debt as a percent of U.S. GDP is now 75%, not counting unfunded obligations like Social Security. So there is this need for centralization, and the global warming, climate change narrative is a wonderful tool in the toolkit for centralization. There's also a deeper reason, and it gets to the utopian movements that captivate mankind without God, because we are naturally religious. We got to worship something, and if we reject God, the natural substitutes throughout history, ancient and modern, is the self and the planet. So it's a useful hammer in the toolkit for those reasons. One last question. Yes? So the question is, the church as a global institution is very large in like 190 some countries. Is it even possible to consistently elect good leaders in such a large organization, and in particular, I'll add to your question, by a subgroup of cardinals who are often approaching 80, who were appointed by a prior pope? And so that's an interesting question. There's a book out there called Bad Popes. And this is no friend of the papacy who wrote this book. I can't remember the person's name. But he acknowledges in the 2,000-year history of the church, he categorizes popes. And in one category is saints or simply good men who did wonderful things but weren't made saints. And he reluctantly concluded 33% of the popes that have ever been elected fall into the category of saints or good men. And he said that by itself is highly unusual in any large organization. And if you think about it, we have 40-some presidents of the United States. Would we say 15 of them were George Washingtons and Abraham Lincolns? We wouldn't. We could probably count on the fingers of one hand presidents who we thought were great men. Less than 10%. So the fact that in this book, the popes that have been selected, over a third were saints or good men, was noteworthy to this person who wasn't going into this research with any warm feelings toward the papacy, and it jarred him. He said, there's something more at work here, namely the Holy Spirit. I want to be respectful of time, so thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.